Tonight, we're going to explore something that seems simple at first, but becomes deeply unsettling the moment you really think about it. The structure of the universe. You've probably imagined space as random, galaxies scattered without pattern, stars placed without meaning, just endless chaos, stretching in every direction, and from where we are, that's exactly how it looks. But here's the problem. That picture isn't real. Because when scientists started mapping the universe, not just observing it, but truly mapping it, something unexpected began to appear. Not randomness, not chaos, but structure, vast, connected, repeating patterns, stretching across distances so large, the human mind struggles to even imagine them. And once you see it, once you understand what's really out there, it changes something fundamental, because the universe might not be random at all. And if you find yourself drawn to these quiet questions, the ones that slowly change how you see reality, consider subscribing to Theories Before Sleep. This is a place where we don't rush, where we take the time to explore ideas properly, and where the deeper you go, the more the universe begins to feel a little less familiar. Let's begin with something that feels obvious. The universe looks random, not in the way scientists describe it, not in the way it's explained in books, but in the way it feels when you look up. Because when you stand outside at night, far from the noise, far from the lights, and you look into the sky, what you see isn't structure, it's scattered light, points separated by darkness, placed without order, some brighter, some barely visible, and most of them just there, with no clear pattern, no visible system, just randomness. And even when your mind tries to create order, connecting stars into shapes, turning them into constellations, you already know something important. Those shapes aren't real. They only exist from your perspective. The stars themselves are not connected. They are separated by distances so vast that even imagining them together is an illusion. And once you realize that, the sky changes. It stops feeling like a picture and starts feeling like noise, random, scattered, without meaning. And when you take that idea further, when you think beyond the stars, the feeling only grows stronger, because now you're not thinking about thousands of points of light. You're thinking about galaxies, entire systems containing billions of stars each, spread across space in every direction, trillions of them, separated by distances so large that even light, traveling faster than anything else in the universe, takes millions, sometimes billions of years, just to move between them. And when you try to imagine all of that together, it becomes overwhelming, too large to picture, too complex to organize, too vast to feel anything other than chaotic. For a long time, that's exactly how we understood it. The universe, at its larger scale, was thought to be mostly random. Matter spread unevenly, shaped locally by gravity, forming stars here, galaxies there. But without any deeper organization, it made sense. Because when something becomes large enough, randomness feels inevitable, like grains of sand scattered across an endless desert, too many to ever form a pattern. But there was a problem with that idea, a quiet one, the kind of problem that doesn't appear immediately, but reveals itself slowly as more information becomes available. Because seeing the universe is not the same as mapping it. Looking at the sky gives you a feeling, but measuring the universe begins to change that feeling. When scientists started going beyond observation, when they began measuring distances, calculating positions, mapping galaxies in three-dimensional space, something unexpected started to happen. At first, it didn't look like anything, just data, points plotted in space, coordinates, redshifts, distances stretching across millions, then billions of light years. But as the data grew, as more galaxies were added to the map, the randomness began to shift, not disappear, but change shape, because galaxies weren't spread evenly. They were grouping, not randomly, but in specific regions. Clusters began to form, massive collections of galaxies, bound together by gravity, stretching across distances so large they could contain thousands of galaxies in a single structure. That part made sense. Gravity pulls matter together. Clusters were expected. But what came next was not, because those clusters weren't isolated. They were connected, linked together by vast, invisible bridges, filaments, enormous structures, stretching across hundreds of millions of light years, thin compared to their length, but massive beyond comprehension. And along these filaments, galaxies continued to form, not scattered, but aligned, as if matter itself was flowing along hidden paths. And between these structures, something even stranger appeared: emptiness. Not small gaps, but vast regions of space, so large they contain almost nothing at all. No galaxies, almost no matter, just darkness, stretching for hundreds of millions of light years. These are not empty spaces in the way we usually imagine emptiness. They are cosmic voids, regions where the structure of the universe simply stops. And when you step back and look at everything together, clusters, filaments, voids, something becomes clear. The universe is not random. It only looks that way when you don't see enough of it. Because once you zoom out far enough, once you stop focusing on individual galaxies and start seeing the full picture, the randomness fades. And what replaces it is something far more unsettling. A pattern. Not a simple one. Not something clean or easy to describe, but a pattern that repeats across distances so large they almost feel unreal. The universe begins to resemble a network, a web, where galaxies trace enormous threads, clusters act like nodes, and voids open between them, like empty spaces in something much larger. And once you see it, once you understand what you're looking at, it changes the way the universe feels, because it's no longer just space, it's structure, something shaped by forces that existed long before galaxies, long before stars, something that determined where everything would eventually form. And that raises a deeper question, one that's difficult to ignore. If the universe has a structure, then where did it come from? Because structure doesn't appear out of nothing. It emerges from something more fundamental, something that existed at the very beginning. And to understand that, we have to go back, not to galaxies, not to stars, but to a time when none of this existed, a time when the universe was something else entirely, simpler but far more important, a time before structure, before patterns, before anything we would recognize. Because the universe did not begin as a web. It did not begin with galaxies or clusters or voids. It began in a state so uniform, so smooth, that there was almost nothing to distinguish one region from another. And yet, from that simplicity, everything you see today somehow emerged, which means the structure we observe now is not random. It is the result of something that happened long ago, something that shaped the universe before it even had stars. And once you begin to understand that, the idea of randomness becomes harder to accept, because patterns like this don't just appear, they grow, they evolve, they follow rules, even if those rules are hidden. And the deeper you look into this structure, the more it begins to feel like the surface of something much larger, something we are only beginning to see. And to understand it, we need to go back to the moment where it all began. To understand how this structure formed, we have to go back, not to galaxies, not to stars, but to a time when none of those things existed. A time when the universe was almost perfectly smooth. Because in the beginning, there was no structure, no clusters, no filaments, no voids, just a dense, hot, expanding state where matter and energy were spread nearly evenly in every direction. If you could have seen it, it wouldn't look like a web. It wouldn't even look like space as we understand it. It would feel uniform, almost featureless. And that's what makes everything that comes next so difficult to explain. Because structure requires difference. It requires imbalance. It requires something to break that perfect uniformity. And yet, somehow, that's exactly what happened. Very early in the universe, tiny fluctuations began to exist. Not large ones, not dramatic changes, just incredibly small variations in density. Regions where matter was very slightly more concentrated, and regions where it was very slightly less. The difference was almost nothing, 1 part in 100,000. So small that if you were there, you would never notice it. But those tiny differences were enough, because once gravity is involved, even the smallest imbalance begins to grow. Regions with slightly more matter have slightly stronger gravity, and stronger gravity pulls in more matter. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but over time, the process becomes unavoidable. More matter leads to stronger gravity. Stronger gravity pulls in more matter, and the difference begins to increase. What was once a tiny fluctuation becomes a region of accumulation, and what was once empty becomes emptier. Because matter isn't just gathering, it's moving, flowing toward these regions, leaving behind vast spaces with less and less material. This is the beginning of structure, not created suddenly, but built slowly, over time, through the simplest force we know, gravity. But gravity alone is not enough to explain what we see today, because there is something else involved, something we cannot see, but that shapes everything. Dark matter. It doesn't emit light. It doesn't reflect it. It doesn't interact with normal matter in any direct way we can observe, and yet it dominates the structure of the universe. In the early universe, before atoms had even fully formed, dark matter was already there, already moving, already responding to gravity. And because it doesn't interact with radiation, it was able to collapse into structures faster than normal matter ever could, while ordinary matter was still scattered, still interacting with light, still resisting collapse. Dark matter was forming the first gravitational framework, invisible but real, and as it gathered, it created wells, regions where gravity became stronger, pulling everything inward. Later, when the universe cooled enough, normal matter began to follow, falling into those same regions, drawn into the structures dark matter had already shaped. And this is where things begin to accelerate, because once matter gathers, it begins to collapse. Clouds of gas form, density increases, temperature rises, and eventually, the first stars ignite. Small at first, then larger, then entire galaxies, forming within these dark matter halos, not randomly, but along the paths that had already been defined. And as more galaxies form, gravity continues to shape their distribution, pulling them together into clusters, connecting those clusters along larger structures, stretching matter into filaments, while leaving behind the emptiness that becomes voids. Over billions of years, this process continues, growing, expanding, refining the structure of the universe, and what began as tiny fluctuations becomes something enormous, a network, a web, where galaxies are no longer isolated systems, but parts of something larger, something connected. And if you could see dark matter directly, the structure would become even clearer, because the visible universe is only part of the picture. Galaxies trace the edges, but the true framework lies beneath them. A vast, invisible structure holding everything in place, guiding where matter gathers, where galaxies form, where emptiness remains, and without it, the universe would look completely different. No filaments, no large-scale structure, just scattered matter, unable to organize itself. But that's not what we see. What we see is the result of billions of years of evolution, a system that began in near uniformity and slowly developed complexity, not by design, but through the interaction of simple rules: gravity, motion, time, and something hidden, shaping everything from the background. And this raises an important realization. The structure of the universe is not something that appeared suddenly. It is something that grew from the smallest possible differences into the largest structures that exist. And even now, that process is not finished. Galaxies are still moving, still merging, still being pulled along these invisible khutut toward regions of greater gravity. Clusters continue to grow, filaments continue to stretch, voids continue to expand. The universe is still evolving, still shaping itself, even after billions of years, which means the structure we see today is only a moment in a much larger process, a snapshot of something that has been unfolding since the very beginning. And that leads to a deeper question, not just how this structure formed, but what it means. Because when something repeats across such enormous scales, when patterns emerge from simplicity and persist across billions of light years, it forces us to reconsider something fundamental. Maybe the universe is not just a collection of objects. Maybe it is a system, a connected whole, shaped by rules we are only beginning to understand. And if that's true, then the structure we observe is not the final layer, it's just the surface, of something deeper. Now that we understand how structure begins, we can finally look at what it becomes. Not in theory, not in equations, but in its full scale. Because when you zoom out far enough, beyond galaxies, beyond clusters, the universe stops looking like space and starts looking like something else, something connected, something continuous, a structure that stretches in every direction with no clear beginning and no visible end. This is what we call the cosmic web, not because it was named that way for effect, but because there is no better way to describe it. Filaments, stretching across hundreds of millions of light years, connecting clusters of galaxies together, forming intersections so massive, they contain some of the largest structures in the universe, and between them, emptiness. Not simple empty space, but vast regions where almost nothing exists. Voids so large they can span distances greater than entire galaxy clusters. If you could place yourself far outside all of this, far beyond the observable universe, and look back, you wouldn't see scattered galaxies. You would see a network, a pattern, a structure that feels almost organic, not alive, but arranged in a way that feels familiar. And that familiarity is not accidental, because the same principles, the same rules that shape structure on smaller scales are also shaping the universe itself. Gravity does not change. It does not behave differently at different scales. The same force that pulls objects together here is shaping structures across billions of light years. And when a single rule is applied over enough time, over enough distance, it begins to produce patterns, not random ones, but consistent ones, patterns that repeat, patterns that scale, patterns that begin to resemble something that almost looks designed, but isn't. And that's where the feeling becomes difficult to ignore, because when you look at the cosmic web, you're not just seeing structure, you're seeing order, emerging from simplicity, repeating across unimaginable scales. And the deeper you examine it, the more it begins to resemble systems we already understand. Networks, circulatory systems, neural connections, patterns that appear in biology, appearing again on the scale of the universe itself. Not because they are the same, but because they follow similar rules: flow, attraction, distribution. These are not biological concepts. They are fundamental. And when they are allowed to operate freely, across enough time, they produce structure, the kind of structure that begins to feel almost inevitable. And yet, there is something about this structure that remains deeply unsettling. Not because it exists, but because of what surrounds it, the void. Because while the filaments connect, while clusters gather, the voids expand, growing larger over time, becoming emptier as matter continues to move away from them. And in these regions, the universe becomes something else entirely, not structured, not connected, but silent, vast, almost completely empty. If you were placed inside one of these voids, far from any galaxy, far from any cluster, the universe would feel different, not just visually, but fundamentally, because you would no longer be inside the web. You would be outside it, surrounded by darkness, with only faint, distant galaxies visible in every direction. Not nearby, not reachable, just distant points, marking the edges of something you are no longer part of. And this changes the way we think about the universe, because It is not uniform. It is not evenly filled. It is divided into regions of connection and regions of isolation, into structure and absence. And that division is not temporary. It is increasing because the universe is still expanding. Not just expanding, but accelerating. Driven by something we don't fully understand, dark energy, a force that does not pull things together, but pushes them apart, slowly at first, but over time, more and more strongly. And as this happens, the structure of the universe begins to change, not by breaking apart, but by becoming more isolated. Clusters remain bound together. Gravity holds them in place, but the space between them continues to expand, stretching the filaments, enlarging the voids, separating structures from each other, more and more over time. And eventually, if this continues, something remarkable will happen. The cosmic web will still exist, but its pieces will no longer be connected in the way they are now. Each cluster, each region of structure will become its own isolated system, surrounded by darkness, with everything else moving further away, beyond visibility, beyond reach. From inside one of these future regions, the universe will look smaller, simpler, more empty, because the light from distant galaxies will no longer reach that observer, not because it doesn't exist, but because space itself is expanding too quickly. And this leads to a strange realization. The structure of the universe is not just something we observe. It is something that depends on when we observe it. Right now, we are in a moment where the cosmic web is still visible, where distant galaxies can still be seen, where the full structure can still be mapped. But this will not always be true. In the far future, observers may not even know the web exists. They may see only their local cluster, surrounded by darkness, with no evidence of anything beyond it. And from their perspective, the universe would appear small, limited, almost empty, which means our understanding, our ability to see structure, is not just based on technology, it is based on timing. We exist in a moment where the universe is still revealing itself, where its structure is still visible, still connected, still understandable. And that makes this moment unique, because we are not just observing the universe, we are observing it at a time when its structure can still be seen as a whole. Before it fades, before it separates, before the connections disappear into darkness. And when you think about that, the cosmic web becomes more than just a structure. It becomes a window, a brief moment, where the universe allows itself to be understood. And once you see it that way, the question changes. It is no longer just about how the universe is structured, but why we are able to see that structure at all, and what it means that we are here at exactly the right time to observe it. Now that we've seen the structure and how it formed, there is a quieter question waiting underneath it all. Not about what the universe looks like, but about how we are able to see it at all. Because everything we've described so far, the clusters, the filaments, the vast empty voids, none of it is directly visible. Not in the way you might imagine. When you look at the night sky, you don't see the cosmic web. You don't see structure. You see stars, and even those are only a small fraction of what actually exists. which means something important is happening. The universe we experience is not the universe as it truly is. It is a filtered version, a limited view, shaped by what our senses can detect and what our instruments allow us to measure. And that limitation matters, because light, the very thing that makes observation possible, does not behave the way we intuitively expect. Light travels. It moves across space at a finite speed, which means every time you see something, you are not seeing it as it is now. You are seeing it as it was. The moon appears as it was a little over a second ago. The sun as it was 8 minutes ago. The nearest stars as they were years ago, and distant galaxies as they were millions, even billions of years in the past. So when we map the universe, we are not looking at a single moment in time. We are looking at layers of history, different regions, frozen at different points in their evolution. And yet, even through that distortion, the structure still appears, still connects, still forms a pattern that remains consistent across space and time. And that is what makes it so powerful, because it means this structure is not an illusion. It is not something created by perspective. It is something real, something persistent, something that exists even when we account for the delay of light itself. But even then, we are still not seeing everything, because most of the universe is invisible, not metaphorically, but literally. Dark matter does not emit light, does not reflect it, does not interact with it in any way we can directly detect. And yet, it outweighs normal matter by a significant margin. It forms the backbone of the cosmic web. It defines the structure long before galaxies ever appear, which means what we see is only the surface. Galaxies are not the structure itself. They are markers, tracing out something deeper, something hidden. And if you could somehow remove all visible matter, all stars, all galaxies, and look only at dark matter, the universe would still have structure. The web would still exist, invisible, but fully intact. And that leads to a strange realization. The universe is not shaped by what we can see. It is shaped by what we cannot. The visible universe is not the foundation. It is the result. And this changes the way we think about observation. Because when we map galaxies, when we trace filaments, when we identify clusters, we are not directly observing the structure itself. We are inferring it, reconstructing it from the behavior of visible matter, from how galaxies move, from how light bends, from how mass is distributed across space. And this is where another phenomenon becomes important. Gravitational lensing. Light does not travel in straight lines, at least not always. When it passes near a massive object, its path bends, not because light changes, but because space itself is curved. And when that happens, we can detect something that would otherwise remain hidden. We can see the influence of mass, even when that mass is invisible. By observing how light from distant galaxies is distorted, stretched, bent around unseen structures, scientists are able to map dark matter itself, not directly, but through its effect on light. And when those maps are created, something remarkable appears. The same structure, the same web, the same network of filaments and voids, now revealed not through galaxies, but through gravity itself, which confirms something fundamental. The cosmic web is real. It is not a visual illusion. It is not a coincidence. It is the underlying structure of the universe. And yet, even with all this knowledge, even with maps, simulations, observations, there is still something we cannot fully explain. Because structure is not just about position. It is about evolution, about how things change over time. And when we look at the universe today, we are seeing a structure that has already been shaped, already been refined, already been stretched across billions of years. But we can also look backward, not just through distant galaxies, but through something far older. The cosmic microwave background, a faint signal coming from the earliest observable moment of the universe, a time when the universe was still hot, still dense, and light was finally able to travel freely. When we observe this radiation, we are looking at the universe as it was nearly 13.8 billion years ago, and what we see is almost uniform, almost perfectly smooth, but not completely, because within that smoothness, there are tiny fluctuations, slight differences in temperature, slight differences in density, the same differences that would later grow into galaxies, clusters, filaments, the same differences that would eventually form the entire structure of the universe, which means the cosmic web did not begin as a web. It began as noise, tiny irregularities, almost invisible, but enough to break the symmetry, enough to give gravity something to work with. And over billions of years, those tiny variations expanded into everything we see today. And this leads to one final realization. The structure of the universe is not imposed. It is not designed. It is not created from complexity. It emerges from simplicity, from small differences, amplified over time, shaped by consistent rules, until they become something vast, something interconnected, something that feels almost intentional. And yet, it is not. It is simply the result of the universe following its own rules over an incomprehensible scale of time. And once you understand that, the idea of randomness becomes harder to accept. Because what we see is not chaos, it is structure emerging from the simplest possible beginnings. And that raises a deeper question, not just about the universe, but about reality itself. If structure can emerge from such simplicity, if patterns can form without intention, if order can arise from tiny fluctuations, then what else might be shaped by the same rules? If structure can emerge from something so simple, then the question begins to shift. It is no longer just about the universe. It becomes about the rules behind it. Because everything we've seen so far, the web, the clusters, the filaments, the voids, all of it comes from a very small set of principles: gravity, motion, time, and something we still don't fully understand. But here's what makes this unsettling. These rules don't change. They don't adapt. They don't respond to scale. The same laws that pull objects together here operate across billions of light years without exception, which means the structure of the universe is not just large, it is consistent, and consistency is what allows patterns to repeat, not in the exact same way, but in ways that feel familiar. And once you begin to notice that, it becomes difficult to ignore, because the cosmic web is not the only structure that looks like this. Similar patterns appear elsewhere, on smaller scales, in systems that are completely unrelated. Networks, branching structures, interconnected systems that distribute matter or energy, all shaped by simple rules, all evolving over time. And while these systems are not the same, they share something deeper. They are all outcomes of processes that favor connection over isolation, flow over stagnation, and balance over uniformity. The universe does not remain smooth. It does not remain evenly distributed. It breaks symmetry. It creates difference. And from that difference, structure begins to form. This is not unique to space. It is a property of systems. Given enough time, given consistent rules, simple beginnings tend to evolve into organized complexity. Not perfectly ordered, but structured enough to be recognized. And the cosmic web is simply the largest example of this. But there is another layer to this idea, one that is easy to overlook, because while gravity pulls matter together, something else is pushing the universe apart. Dark energy, a force that does not create structure, but works against it, expanding space itself, increasing the distance between everything. And this creates a tension between attraction and expansion, between structure and separation. Gravity tries to connect, dark energy tries to isolate, and the universe exists between these two influences, which means the cosmic web is not a permanent state. It is a phase, a temporary balance between forces that are constantly shaping reality. Over time, that balance will change. Dark energy will continue to push space outward, faster and faster. And while gravity will keep galaxies bound within clusters, the connections between those clusters will weaken, filaments will stretch, voids will expand, and eventually the web itself will begin to dissolve, not by breaking apart suddenly, but by fading, becoming less connected, less visible, less complete, until one day, from the perspective of any single region, the universe will no longer appear as a web at all. It will appear isolated, a single cluster of galaxies, surrounded by darkness, with no visible evidence of the larger structure that once existed. And that leads to a strange conclusion. The cosmic web is something we can only see because of when we exist. Not just where, but when. We are in a moment where the universe is old enough for structure to have formed, but not so old that it has disappeared. A narrow window in which the full pattern is still visible. And that makes our perspective extremely rare, because in the past, the structure did not yet exist, and in the future, it will no longer be observable, which means the cosmic web is not just a feature of the universe, it is a moment in its history, a phase that we happen to be able to witness. And once you understand that, the feeling changes again, because now you are not just observing structure, you are observing something temporary, something that exists only for a limited time before the universe continues evolving. And that brings us back to the deeper question, not just how structure forms, but why it feels so familiar, why patterns repeat, why systems emerge, why complexity grows from simplicity in ways that seem almost inevitable. Because if the same rules apply everywhere, if the same processes create structure at every scale, then the universe is not just a place where things happen. It is a system that generates patterns continuously, across time, across space, and we are part of that system. not separate from it, not observing from the outside, but existing within the same rules, shaped by the same forces, influenced by the same processes that created everything else. Which means the structure of the universe is not something distant. It is not something abstract. It is something we are connected to in ways that are not immediately obvious, but are fundamentally real. And once you begin to see it that way, the universe stops feeling random, not because everything is ordered, but because everything follows rules. Rules that produce patterns, rules that create structure, rules that shape reality, from the smallest scale to the largest. And the cosmic web is simply the most visible expression of that. A structure so vast that it reveals something deeper, not about space, but about how reality itself works. And once you understand that, the final question becomes unavoidable. If the universe naturally creates structure, if patterns emerge from simple rules, if complexity grows over time, then what is the final state? Where does this process lead? Because the universe is still evolving, still expanding, still changing, which means the structure we see now is not the end. It is just another step in something much larger. If the universe is still evolving, then the structure we see now is not the final form. It is a phase, a moment in a process that has been unfolding for billions of years and will continue long after everything familiar disappears. To understand where this leads, you have to think beyond galaxies, beyond stars, beyond anything that produces light, because the future of the universe is not defined by what shines. It is defined by what remains when the light is gone. Right now, the cosmic web is still visible. Filaments stretch across space. Clusters gather matter. Galaxies collide, merge, evolve. The universe feels active, dynamic, full of movement. But that activity is temporary because every star, no matter how large, has a limit, a finite amount of fuel. And when that fuel is gone, the star fades, slowly or violently, but inevitably, over time, fewer new stars will form. Gas clouds will be used up or dispersed, leaving less material available for future generations. Star formation will slow, then decline, then eventually stop. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, over trillions of years. And as that happens, the universe will begin to change in a way that is difficult to imagine. Because light, which now defines our understanding of space, will become rare. Galaxies will still exist, but they will no longer be filled with bright young stars. They will become dim, quiet, dominated by remnants, white dwarfs, neutron stars, black holes, objects that do not shine the way stars do, objects that mark the end of stellar evolution, rather than its beginning. And yet, even as stars fade, the structure of the universe will still be there. The web will not disappear immediately. Clusters will remain bound together by gravity. Galaxies will continue orbiting within them. But something else will continue to change. The space between these structures will keep expanding. Dark energy will not stop. It will continue pushing, stretching the universe further and further apart, and over enough time, that expansion will dominate everything. Filaments will thin, connections will weaken, and the cosmic web will begin to fragment, not violently, not through destruction, but through separation. Structures that were once connected will become isolated, each cluster, each gravitationally bound system, turning into its own universe, surrounded by darkness, with everything else moving further away, beyond detection, beyond reach. And from inside one of these future regions, the universe will appear very different. There will be no visible web, no distant galaxies outlining a larger structure, just a single cluster containing everything that can still be observed. Everything else gone, not destroyed, but carried away by the expansion of space, beyond the point where light can ever return. And this leads to a strange conclusion. The universe will not just become darker, it will become simpler, not in its actual structure, but in what can be observed, because information itself will begin to disappear, not erased, but hidden, locked beyond distances that can never be crossed. And as this process continues, even the remnants of stars will begin to fade. White dwarfs will cool, becoming black dwarfs. Neutron stars will lose energy. Black holes will slowly evaporate through a process so slow, it takes longer than almost any timescale we can imagine. But given enough time, even they will disappear. And when that happens, the universe will reach a state unlike anything that exists today. No stars, no galaxies, no structure that can be seen, only particles spread across an ever-expanding space, cold, silent, and almost perfectly uniform once again. In a way, the universe will return to something similar to its beginning. Not the same, but closer than anything in between, smooth, featureless, without the structures that once defined it. And this creates a strange symmetry. The universe begins simple, becomes complex, forms structure, builds patterns, and then, slowly, returns to simplicity again. Not because structure fails, but because the conditions that support it eventually disappear. And if you step back and look at the entire process, it begins to feel like something larger. Not a cycle, not a loop, but a progression from uniformity to structure and back toward uniformity. And within that progression, there is a window, a period where structure exists, where complexity reaches its peak, where patterns can be observed, understood, and questioned. That window is now, because we exist in a universe that is still bright enough, still connected enough to reveal its structure, but not so young. That structure has not yet formed, and not so old that it has already faded away, which makes this moment incredibly rare, not just in time, but in possibility, because this is the only stage where the universe can be understood as a whole, where the web can still be seen, where connections still exist, where patterns are still visible. And once that stage passes, that understanding may no longer be possible. Future observers, if they exist, may never know the universe once had structure at all. They may see only isolation, only darkness, only a small region of space with no evidence of anything beyond it. And from their perspective, the universe would appear simple, limited, almost empty, which means the structure we see today is not just a feature of the universe. It is a temporary truth, something that exists only for a brief period before it fades into something else. And that leads to one final thought. The universe is not just a place where structure exists. It is a place where structure appears, evolves, and disappears, following rules that never change, but producing outcomes that do. And within that process, we exist, observing it, trying to understand it, at the only time when that understanding is possible, which means the question is no longer just about the universe. It is about us, why we are here at this moment, able to see what we see, and what it means that the structure of the universe is visible just long enough for something to notice it. If the structure of the universe is only visible for a limited time, then what we're really looking at is not just space, but a moment, a specific point in the history of everything where complexity has fully formed but has not yet begun to disappear. And that changes the way we should think about it, because the cosmic web is not just something that exists, it is something that is happening right now, still evolving, still moving, still being shaped by forces that have been acting since the beginning. Galaxies are not fixed in place. They are not static points in a map. They are in motion, always, drifting along filaments, pulled toward regions of greater gravity, moving through space in ways that are too slow to notice in a human lifetime, but constant over cosmic time. Entire clusters are shifting, rotating, colliding, merging into larger structures. And when two galaxies meet, they don't simply pass by each other. They interact. Their gravity distorts their shapes, pulls stars into long arcs, stretches them into streams of light that wrap around both systems. Over time, they merge, not violently in the way we imagine collisions, but slowly, as gravity reshapes both into something new. This is how structure grows, not by remaining stable, but by constantly changing, by absorbing, combining, evolving into larger forms. And this process never truly stops. Even now, our own galaxy is moving. The Milky Way is not isolated. It is part of a cluster, moving within a larger structure. And in the distant future, it will merge with another galaxy and become something else entirely. Which means we are not just observers of the cosmic web. We are participants in it. Our galaxy is part of a filament, part of a cluster, part of the same structure that stretches across the universe. And everything that happens here is connected to what happens elsewhere, not directly, but through the same rules, the same forces, the same patterns that shape everything. And yet, even with all this motion, even with all this change, there is a limit, a boundary, not in space, but in what can be known. Because no matter how far we look, no matter how advanced our instruments become, there is a point beyond which we cannot see, not because nothing exists there, but because light has not had time to reach us. This is the observable universe, a sphere centered around us, defined not by position, but by time. Everything inside it is visible. Everything beyond it remains unknown. And this creates a fundamental limitation, because the cosmic web we observe is only part of the full structure. We cannot see its true extent. We cannot see where it ends, or if it ends at all. We can only map what is within our reach, which means our understanding is incomplete. Not because we lack knowledge, but because reality itself is larger than what can be observed. And this leads to another unsettling thought. The structure we see may not be unique. It may continue, far beyond the observable universe, repeating extending, forming patterns we will never detect, entire regions of structure existing beyond our horizon, forever hidden from view. Which means the cosmic web might be far larger than we can ever confirm. And if that's true, then what we call the universe is only a small part of something greater, not a complete picture, but a limited one. And this changes the meaning of observation again, because we are not just seeing structure, we are seeing the part of structure that is accessible to us, a fragment, a section of something much larger, and within that section, everything appears connected. But beyond it, there may be more filaments, more clusters, more voids, extending endlessly beyond what we can ever reach. And if you take that idea further, the question becomes even deeper. Not just how large the structure is, but whether it has any boundary at all. Because if the universe is infinite, then the cosmic web is infinite, not repeating exactly, but continuing, shaped by the same rules, across an unlimited scale. And if that's the case, then there is no final structure, no ultimate pattern, only continuation. And that idea is difficult to hold on to, because it removes the idea of completion. It removes the idea that the universe has a final form. Instead, it becomes something ongoing, something that never stops evolving, never stops expanding, never reaches a final state in the way we might expect. And within that, our position becomes even more specific, because we are not just inside the cosmic web. We are inside a part of it, at a specific time, with a limited view, trying to understand something that extends far beyond our perspective, which means every conclusion we reach is based on partial information, not incorrect, but incomplete. And yet, even within those limits, the structure is clear enough, consistent enough, to reveal something fundamental. The universe is not random, not at the larger scale, not in the way it organizes matter, not in the way patterns emerge. But that does not mean it is controlled. It does not mean it is designed. It means something else. It means that simple rules, applied over enough time, can create complexity that feels intentional, even when it is not. And that realization changes everything, because it suggests that structure is not special. It is inevitable. Given the right conditions, given enough time, the universe will always evolve toward patterns, toward systems, toward connections. And we are seeing one version of that outcome, not the only one, but one that exists here, now. And once you understand that, the final question becomes clearer, not about what the universe is, but about what it is becoming. If the universe is still becoming something, then what we see now is not the answer. It's a stage, a temporary form, shaped by rules that have been unfolding since the beginning, but not yet finished. And that idea is difficult to hold on to, because we tend to think of the universe as something complete, a finished system with defined structures, fixed laws, and a clear identity. But everything we've seen suggests something else. The universe is not static. It is not settled. It is still in motion, still changing, even at the largest possible scale. The cosmic web, as vast as it is not permanent. It is shaped by forces that continue to act on it, slowly altering its form over time. Gravity continues to pull matter inward, strengthening local structures, while dark energy continues to push everything outward, weakening the connections between them. And this tension between attraction and expansion defines the future of the universe, not in a sudden way, but in a gradual one, because nothing in the universe changes instantly at this scale. Everything unfolds slowly across billions, then trillions of years. And if you follow that process forward, something begins to emerge. Not a final structure, but a direction, a movement away from connection toward isolation. Over time, the web becomes less connected. Filaments stretch thinner, voids expand wider, clusters drift further apart, until eventually, the connections that once defined the structure are no longer visible, not because they disappear completely, but because space itself has expanded so much that they no longer interact. The universe does not break apart, it separates, and this separation changes everything, because once structures are isolated, their evolution becomes internal. Galaxies within a cluster will continue to interact, merge, evolve into larger systems, but beyond that cluster, there will be nothing. No incoming matter, no external influence, no visible connection to anything else. Each region becomes its own closed system, a small island in an ever-expanding ocean of darkness. And from within that island, the universe will appear completely different, not vast and connected, but limited and empty. Observers in that future would not see a cosmic web. They would not see distant clusters or filaments stretching across space. They would see only their local region, and beyond it, nothing. Not because nothing exists, but because the expansion of space has carried everything else beyond reach. And this leads to a powerful realization. The structure of the universe is not just something that forms and evolves. It is something that can disappear from observation, not destroyed, but hidden. And that changes the meaning of what we know, because our understanding of the universe depends entirely on what we can observe, and what we can observe depends on when we exist. Right now, we exist at a time when the universe is still transparent to us. Light from distant galaxies still reaches us. The structure is still visible. The web is still connected, at least from our perspective. But that will not always be true. In the far future, the observable universe will shrink, not physically, but in what can be seen. As more and more regions move beyond the horizon, the amount of visible structure will decrease, until eventually, only a single cluster remains observable, and at that point, the idea of a larger universe may no longer exist. Future observers may conclude that their cluster is all there is, because there would be no evidence to suggest otherwise, no distant galaxies, no background radiation, no visible structure beyond their immediate surroundings. And from their perspective, the universe would appear simple, static, almost empty, which means something profound. The complexity we see today, the structure we map, the patterns we analyze, are not permanent truths. They are temporary observations, dependent on timing, dependent on position, dependent on the stage of the universe itself. And once you understand that, the cosmic web becomes something more than a structure. It becomes a fleeting phenomenon, a brief period in cosmic history where the universe reveals its full complexity before it begins to fade into something simpler. And that brings us back to the deeper idea The universe begins simple, becomes complex, forms structure, and then, slowly, returns towards simplicity again. Not in the same way, but in a way that reduces what can be seen, what can be known, what can be connected. And within that progression, there is a peak, a moment where complexity is at its highest, where structure is fully formed, but not yet lost. That moment is now. Because we exist in a universe where the web is still visible, where the connections still exist, where the full structure can still be traced. And that makes this moment incredibly rare, not just in time, but in possibility, because this is the only stage where the universe can be understood as a whole, where its patterns can be observed and its structure can be studied. And once this stage passes, that understanding may no longer be possible, which means the cosmic web is not just something we observe. It is something we are lucky enough to witness, a structure that exists just long enough for something to notice it. And that leads to a final thought, not about the universe itself, but about what it means to observe it. Because if the structure is temporary, if the patterns will eventually disappear from view, then the act of understanding them becomes something more significant, not just a scientific process, but a moment of awareness, a point in time where the universe is able to be seen and understood from within. And that may be the most unusual part of all. If understanding the universe is only possible for a limited time, then what we're really facing is not just a scientific question, but a deeper limitation, not of knowledge, but of perspective. Because everything we've described so far, the cosmic web, the structure of galaxies, the expansion of space, all of it depends on a single condition, that we can observe it. And observation is not unlimited. It is constrained by distance, by time, and by the speed of light itself, which means there is a boundary, not a physical edge, but a limit to what can ever be seen. The observable universe, everything within it, is part of our reality. Everything beyond it exists, but remains permanently hidden. And this is not a temporary barrier. It is fundamental. No matter how advanced we become, no matter how far technology progresses, we cannot see beyond that horizon, not because we lack the tools, but because the universe itself does not allow it. Light from those regions has not reached us, and in many cases never will, which means the structure we observe is incomplete, not incorrect, but limited, a fragment of something larger. And this raises a question that is difficult to answer. Is the cosmic web we see representative of the entire universe, or is it just one section of a much larger pattern? Because if the universe extends beyond what we can observe, then the structure must extend as well. Filaments continuing outward, clusters forming in regions we cannot detect, voids expanding into areas that remain forever hidden. And if that's true, then the cosmic web has no visible boundary, no clear edge, only continuation, stretching beyond our horizon, repeating, evolving in ways we will never directly observe. And that leads to another realization. Our position in the universe is not central, not special, not unique. We are not at the center of the structure. We are inside it. One location, among countless others, each with its own perspective, its own observable region, its own limited view of the whole, which means every observer in every part of the universe sees a different version of reality. Not a different universe, but a different slice of it. And from each of those slices, the structure may look slightly different. The distribution of galaxies, the shape of filaments, the arrangement of clusters, all depending on where you are and how much of the universe is visible to you. And yet, despite these differences, the underlying rules remain the same. Gravity behaves the same everywhere. Expansion continues in every direction. Dark matter shapes structure consistently, which means that even if the details change, the overall pattern does not. Structure still emerges, connections still form, voids still expand, and this suggests something important. The cosmic web is not a coincidence. It is a consequence, a natural outcome of the rules that govern the universe. And because those rules apply everywhere, the structure must exist everywhere as well. Not identical in every region, but following the same principles, which means the universe at its larger scale is not random. It is patterned, not designed, but shaped by consistent processes. And once you understand that, another question begins to form, not about what we see, but about what we cannot. Because beyond the observable universe, there may be more structure, more complexity, more patterns, extending beyond anything we can measure. Entire regions of space, following the same rules, but forever hidden from our view. And this creates a kind of boundary, not of space, but of knowledge, a limit to what can be confirmed, a horizon beyond which certainty disappears, and beyond that horizon, we can only imagine. We can build models, run simulations, extend our theories, but we cannot observe directly, which means part of the universe will always remain unknown, not temporarily, but permanently. And that may be the most important limitation of all, because it means our understanding, no matter how advanced, will never be complete. There will always be more, beyond what we can see, beyond what we can measure, beyond what we can confirm. And within that uncertainty, the structure we observe becomes even more significant, because it is not just what we know, it is the edge of what we can know, the boundary between observation and speculation, between measurement and imagination. And standing at that boundary, looking outward, the cosmic web becomes something more than a structure. It becomes a clue, a hint of something larger, something that extends beyond our reach, but follows the same rules. And once you see it that way, the final question begins to take shape, not about the universe we can observe, but about the one we cannot. Because if structure continues beyond our horizon, if patterns extend into regions we will never see, then what we call the universe may only be a small part of something far greater, and that possibility is difficult to ignore. If everything we can observe is only a small part of something larger, then the structure we've been following, the web of galaxies, the filaments, the vast, expanding voids, is not the full picture. It's a fragment, a visible layer of a reality that extends far beyond what we will ever be able to confirm. And that changes the question one final time, because at this point, it is no longer about how the universe is structured, or how that structure formed, or even how it will evolve. It becomes something quieter, something more fundamental. What does it mean that a structure like this exists at all? Not in detail, not in specific measurements, but in principle. Because what we've seen is not randomness, not chaos, but a consistent pattern emerging from simple rules, repeating across unimaginable scales. And that pattern does not depend on us. It existed long before we appeared. It will continue long after we're gone. It does not change based on observation. It simply unfolds, quietly, continuously. And within that unfolding, something unusual has happened. Not at the scale of galaxies, not at the scale of clusters, but at a much smaller level. Something has emerged that can observe the structure itself, not just exist within it, but recognize it, understand it, question it. And that creates a strange situation, because the universe is not just forming patterns. It is producing something that can become aware of those patterns, not intentionally, not by design, but as a consequence of the same rules, the same processes that created everything else. And once you realize that, the structure of the universe becomes something more than physical. It becomes relational, because it is not just something that exists. It is something that can be perceived, something that can be interpreted, something that can be understood, at least partially, from within. And that changes the role of observation itself, because observing the universe is not just about gathering information. It is about connecting patterns, recognizing structure, finding meaning in systems that were not created with meaning in mind. And this does not make the universe intentional. It does not imply design, but it does reveal something important. That the same rules which create structure can also create the ability to understand that structure, which means complexity does not stop at galaxies. It continues into systems capable of reflection, into observers capable of looking outward and asking questions about what they see. And that leads to a final perspective, one that is easy to overlook, because when we talk about the universe, we tend to place ourselves outside of it, as if we are separate observers, studying something distant. But that is not true. We are part of the same system, formed by the same processes, shaped by the same rules, existing within the same structure that we are trying to understand, which means the cosmic web is not something external. It includes us. Not directly, not at the scale of individual structures, but at the level of origin. Everything we are made of, every atom, every particle, was once part of that same unfolding process, the same early fluctuations, the same gravitational collapse, the same formation of stars and galaxies, all leading, eventually, to this moment. And this moment is not special in the way we might imagine. It is not central. It is not unique in position, but it is specific in time, because we exist at a point where the universe is still visible to itself, where structure can still be observed, where patterns can still be recognized, where questions can still be asked. And that is not something that will always be true. As the universe continues to expand, as light fades, as structure becomes less connected, the ability to observe the full pattern will disappear, not gradually in a way that is obvious, but inevitably. And when that happens, the universe will still exist. The structure will still be there, in whatever form it has evolved into, but the awareness of that structure may no longer exist in the same way, which means this moment is not just about what the universe is. It is about what can be known about it, a brief period where complexity and visibility overlap, where structure exists and can be understood. And once that overlap ends, the universe will continue. But the ability to see it as a whole may not. And that leaves us with one final thought. Not about the beginning, not about the end, but about the present. Because right now, the universe is structured, it is connected, it is visible, and within it, there are observers capable of recognizing that structure, capable of tracing the filaments, mapping the clusters, identifying the voids, and asking what it all means. And that may be the most unusual part of all. Not that the universe has a structure, but that something within it can see it. There's one more step we haven't taken, not outward, but inward. Because everything we've described so far, the web, the clusters, the voids, all exist on a scale so large, it's easy to feel separate from it, as if the universe is something distant, something happening far away, with no direct connection to us. But that separation is an illusion, not because we are physically close to these structures, but because we are made from the same process. The same rules that shaped the cosmic web also shaped everything here. Every atom, every particle has followed the same history. From the early universe, through the formation of stars, through the creation of heavier elements, through the collapse of matter into planets, and eventually into systems capable of awareness. There is no separation in origin, only a difference in scale. And once you recognize that, the idea of the cosmic web changes again, because it is not just something you observe, it is something you are part of. Not in position, but in process. And that process is continuous. It does not stop at galaxies. It does not end with stars. It continues into smaller and smaller systems, each shaped by the same fundamental rules. And this is where the idea becomes more difficult to ignore. Because if the same principles apply everywhere, if the same forces create structure at every level, then the difference between scales is not as absolute as it seems. The universe is not divided into separate layers. It is continuous, from the largest structures to the smallest interactions. Everything connected, not directly, but through the same underlying rules. And this leads to a subtle shift in perspective. Because instead of thinking of the universe as something out there, it becomes something that includes everything. Not just space, but matter, energy, and the processes that shape them, including the processes that led to this moment. And this moment is not separate from the structure. It is part of it, the same way a galaxy is part of a filament, and a filament is part of the web. This moment exists within that same unfolding system, and that realization removes something. The idea of distance, not physical distance, but conceptual distance, the sense that the universe is something external, something we are observing from the outside, because there is no outside. There is only the system itself, and within that system, everything follows the same progression, from simplicity to complexity, to structure, and eventually towards separation again. And that progression does not stop. It continues beyond what we can observe, beyond what we can measure, beyond what we can fully understand. But even within those limits, there is something clear. The universe is not static. It is not complete. It is not finished. It is in motion, always, and everything within it is part of that motion, including us, not as observers standing apart, but as outcomes of the same processes, temporary forms shaped by the same forces, existing for a limited time within a system that continues to evolve. And that brings the idea full circle, because the structure of the universe is not something fixed. It is something that appears, changes, and eventually fades, just like everything else within it. And yet, during the time it exists, it reveals something important. That complexity can emerge from simplicity, that patterns can form without intention, that structure can exist without design, and that understanding is not separate from the structure itself. It is part of it, because the ability to recognize patterns, to understand systems, to ask questions about reality, is also an outcome of the same rules, which means the universe does not just create structure. It creates the ability to understand that structure, not deliberately, not with intention, but as a natural consequence of complexity. And once you see that, the final perspective becomes clear. The universe is not just something that exists. It is something that unfolds, step by step, from the simplest beginnings to the most complex forms, and eventually towards something else entirely. And within that unfolding, there are moments, points in time, where structure is visible, where patterns can be recognized, where understanding is possible. This is one of those moments, not permanent, not guaranteed, but real. And that may be enough. By now, the structure is clear, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to change the way you see the universe. It is not random, not at the scale that matters, not in the way it organizes matter, not in the way patterns emerge, not in the way everything connects across unimaginable distances. What once felt like chaos now feels like something else, something shaped, something consistent, something that follows rules, even if those rules are not fully understood. And yet, there is one final step, not in the science, but in the way we think about it, because understanding structure is not the same as understanding meaning. The universe does not explain itself. It does not provide answers. It presents patterns. It reveals structure. And then it leaves the interpretation to us, which means everything we've explored, the cosmic web, the emergence of structure, the evolution of complexity, is not a conclusion. It is a perspective, a way of seeing reality that did not exist before we were able to observe it. And that perspective is temporary, not because the structure will disappear entirely, but because the ability to see it will. The universe will continue to expand, continue to evolve, continue to move toward a state where connections are lost, where light fades, where observation becomes limited. And when that happens, the structure we see today will no longer be visible in the same way. The web will still exist in some form, but it will no longer be something that can be mapped or understood as a whole. And that changes the meaning of everything we've explored. because it means this understanding is not permanent. It is not a final truth that will always be known. It is something that exists only within a specific window of time, a brief period where the universe is both complex enough to have structure and transparent enough for that structure to be observed. And within that window, something unusual happens. The universe becomes visible to itself, not in a conscious way, not in a deliberate sense, but through systems capable of observation, systems that can look outward and recognize patterns that exist beyond their immediate environment. And that recognition is not separate from the structure. It is part of it, because the same rules that created galaxies also created the conditions for awareness, not intentionally, but inevitably. Given enough time, given enough complexity, systems emerge that can reflect on their own existence, and in doing so, they reveal something that would otherwise remain unnoticed. The pattern, the structure, the connection between everything. And yet, even this recognition has limits, because no matter how much we learn, no matter how detailed our maps become, there will always be boundaries. The observable universe defines what we can see. The laws of physics define what we can measure. And beyond those limits, there will always be uncertainty, regions of reality that remain hidden, not because they are unreachable, but because they are fundamentally unobservable. And this uncertainty is not a flaw. It is part of the system. Because the universe does not reveal everything at once, it does not provide a complete picture. It offers fragments, pieces that can be connected, but never fully completed. And within those fragments, we build understanding, not absolute, but evolving, expanding as new observations are made, shifting as new patterns are discovered. And this process mirrors the universe itself, constantly changing, constantly developing, never reaching a final state. And that may be the most important realization of all. The universe is not something that can be fully understood, not because it is too complex, but because it is still unfolding, still evolving, still moving towards something we cannot yet see. And within that movement, there are moments of clarity, moments where patterns become visible, where structure can be recognized, where the complexity of everything aligns just enough to be understood. This is one of those moments. A point in time where the universe reveals its structure, where the cosmic web can be traced, where the connections between galaxies can be mapped, and where the deeper patterns of reality can be explored. And once that moment passes, the structure will not vanish completely, but the ability to see it as a whole will, which means what we have now is not just knowledge, it is access, a brief opportunity to observe the universe in a state where its full complexity is still visible. And that makes this perspective rare, not because the universe is special, but because this moment is a moment where everything aligns just long enough for structure to be seen, understood, and questioned. And in the end, that may be enough. There is one final way to look at all of this, not as a story with a beginning and an end, but as a pattern that reveals itself only when you step back far enough, because everything we've followed, from the first tiny fluctuations to the formation of galaxies, to the vast web that connects them, is not a series of separate events. It is one continuous process, a gradual unfolding, driven by simple rules, extended across unimaginable time. And when you look at it that way, the universe stops feeling like a place. It starts to feel like a progression, from uniformity to variation, from variation to structure, from structure to complexity. And now, from complexity to awareness. Not because awareness was the goal, not because the universe was moving toward it, but because given enough time, enough interactions, enough structure, it becomes possible. And once it becomes possible, it happens. Somewhere, at some scale, for some amount of time. And that changes the entire perspective. Because now, the cosmic web is not just something that exists. It is something that can be known. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to be recognized, enough to reveal that it is not random, enough to show that it follows rules, that patterns repeat, that structure emerges. And once that recognition happens, the universe is no longer just a system. It becomes something that can be understood from within, not fully, but partially. And that is something unusual, because most systems do not contain their own observers. Most processes do not generate something capable of reflecting on them. But this one does. Not everywhere, not always, but in certain conditions, at certain moments, it happens. And we are inside one of those moments, not because it was meant to happen, but because it could. And that possibility is enough, because everything else follows from it. The ability to observe, the ability to map, the ability to question, all emerge from the same unfolding process that created the structure itself, which means there is no clear boundary between observer and system. There is no separation between what is being studied and what is doing the studying. Both are outcomes of the same rules. Both are shaped by the same forces. Both exist within the same structure. And that realization removes something important. The idea that the universe is something external, something distant, something separate from us. Because there is no outside perspective. There is only the internal view, the view from within the structure itself. And from that perspective, everything we see, everything we measure, everything we understand is part of the same system, which means our understanding will always be limited, not because the universe is unknowable, but because we are part of it, observing from the inside, with a perspective that is shaped by position, by time, and by the limits of observation itself. And yet, even with those limits, something remarkable remains. The ability to recognize structure at all, to see patterns across billions of light years, to understand that the universe is not random, but follows consistent rules. And that recognition is not trivial. It is not guaranteed. It depends on conditions that may only exist for a limited time. A moment where the universe is still visible, still connected, still structured in a way that can be observed. And once that moment passes, the structure will remain, but the ability to see it as a whole may not, which means what we are doing now, mapping the web, understanding its formation, recognizing its patterns, is something temporary. Not because the knowledge will be lost immediately, but because the conditions that allow that knowledge to exist will eventually change. And when they do, the universe will still be there, still evolving, still following the same rules. But the perspective we have now will no longer be possible. And that leaves us with one final thought, not about the structure itself, but about the act of understanding it. Because if the universe can only be fully observed for a limited time, then understanding becomes something more than information. It becomes a moment, a point in the history of the universe, where complexity and awareness overlap, where structure exists and can be recognized. And that overlap is not permanent. It is a brief alignment between what exists and what can be known. And once you see it that way, the structure of the universe is no longer just something out there. It is something that happens to be visible right now from within. And now there is almost nothing left to add. Not because there is nothing more to discover, but because we've reached the edge of what can be said without stepping beyond what can be known. The structure is there. The pattern is real. The universe is not random, at least not in the way it first appears. But beyond that, the answers begin to fade, not into confusion, but into uncertainty. Because every step we've taken, from the smallest fluctuations to the largest structures, has brought us closer to a boundary, not a physical edge, but a limit of perspective, a point where observation becomes incomplete and explanation becomes interpretation. And that boundary matters because it reminds us of something simple and easy to forget. The universe does not owe us an answer. It does not explain itself. It does not provide meaning. It simply unfolds according to rules that remain consistent, whether we understand them or not. And within that unfolding, structure appears, patterns form, complexity grows, and for a brief moment, that complexity becomes visible, not just to instruments, but to awareness. And that is where we are, inside that moment, observing a structure that exists just long enough to be seen as a whole, just long enough to be understood, at least in part, and just long enough for questions to be asked about it. Because beyond this moment, things begin to change, not suddenly, not in a way that would be obvious, but slowly, over time. The connections weaken, the distances grow, the light fades, and the structure, while still present, becomes harder to see, harder to measure, harder to understand as a complete system, until eventually it is no longer possible to view it as a whole at all. And when that happens, the universe will still exist, the web will still be there, in whatever form it has evolved into. But the perspective we have now will no longer be available, which means this moment is not just a point in time. It is a condition, a specific alignment between structure, visibility, and awareness. And that alignment is rare, not because the universe is unusual, but because the conditions required to observe it fully are temporary. And that leads to a final shift in perspective, because once you accept that, the importance of the structure itself begins to change. It is no longer just something to map, or measure, or explain. It becomes something to recognize, something that exists independently of observation, but becomes meaningful only when it is seen. And that meaning is not fixed. It is not defined by the universe. It is created through the act of understanding, through the process of connecting patterns, interpreting structure, and asking what it all represents. And that process is not separate from the universe. It is part of it. Because the same rules that created galaxies also created the conditions for thought, for reflection, for awareness. And within that awareness, the universe gains something it does not have on its own: the ability to be recognized, not in a conscious sense, not as an intention, but as a result of complexity reaching a certain level. And once that happens, the structure is no longer just physical. It becomes something that can be experienced, understood, even if only partially. And that is where everything comes together: the structure, the rules, the evolution, the limits of observation, all leading to this point. Not a conclusion, but a perspective, a way of seeing the universe that reveals it as something more than random, but less than intentional. Something that follows rules, but does not aim toward a goal. Something that creates patterns without meaning, until meaning is applied to them. And within that, there is a kind of balance between what exists and what can be known, between structure and understanding, between the universe and the awareness that observes it. And that balance is not permanent. It is something that appears, exists for a time, and then fades, just like everything else in the universe. And so, what remains is not an answer, not a final explanation, but a recognition that the universe has a structure. That structure can be seen, and for a brief moment, it can be understood. There is one last way to look at everything you've just heard. Not as a collection of facts, not as a timeline, but as a single, continuous moment stretched across billions of years. Because from the beginning, from the first tiny fluctuations in a nearly uniform universe to the vast network of galaxies we now call the cosmic web, nothing has truly been separate. Every step, every transition has been part of the same unfolding process, a process that never paused, never reset, never started over. It simply continued, expanding, evolving, shaping itself through the same rules over and over again. And within that process, something remarkable appeared. Not structure, not galaxies, not even the web itself, but awareness, the ability for part of the universe to observe the rest of it, not from the outside, but from within. And that changes everything, because it means the universe is not just something that exists. It is something that can be experienced, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to reveal its patterns, enough to show that what once looked like randomness is actually structure. What once felt like chaos is actually consistency. And what once seemed disconnected is part of something continuous. And yet, even with that understanding, there is no final answer waiting at the end. No single explanation that resolves everything. Because the universe is not something that can be reduced to a single idea. It is too large, too complex, too continuous. Instead, what we have is something else. A clearer picture, not complete, but more accurate than before. A recognition that the universe follows rules, that those rules produce patterns, and that those patterns can be understood, at least for now, because that is the final piece. For now, everything we've explored, every structure, every connection, every pattern exists within a limited window of visibility, a period in the universe's history where complexity and observation overlap, where the cosmic web is still connected, still visible, still traceable across vast distances, and where something within that structure can recognize it. But that window will not remain open forever. The universe will continue to expand. Light will continue to fade. Structures will continue to separate. And eventually, the connections that define the cosmic web will no longer be visible as a whole, not because they are gone, but because they are no longer accessible. And when that happens, the universe will still exist. It will still follow the same rules. It will still evolve. But the perspective we have now will disappear, which means this moment is not just another point in time. It is a rare alignment, a brief phase, where the universe is both structured and visible, and capable of being understood from within. And that makes everything you've just seen, everything you now understand, something temporary. Not in the sense that it will be forgotten, but in the sense that it will no longer be observable. And that changes the meaning of knowledge itself. Because knowing something is not just about having information. It is about having access, being in the right place, at the right time, under the right conditions, to observe what exists. And right now, those conditions are met. The universe is open enough, connected enough, and transparent enough for its structure to be seen, for its patterns to be recognized, for its rules to be studied. And that is not something we should take for granted, because it is not permanent. It is a phase, a moment, where everything aligns just enough for understanding to exist. And once that alignment ends, the universe will continue, but the ability to see it as a whole will not. So in the end, the structure of the universe is not just something out there. It is something that is visible, here, now, for a limited time. A pattern that has emerged from simplicity, grown into complexity, and will eventually fade into something else. And within that pattern, there is a moment, a brief overlap between what exists and what can be known. And that moment is where we are.